One day, I went to look at an abandoned Austin 7 and found that a tree had grown straight through the car. Not beside it, through it. A small tree had come up through the floor where the battery box used to be under the driver's seat, pushed the squab aside, and eventually emerged through the sliding roof. And the strange thing was the owner still thought it might start. At that time, people around the area knew me as someone interested in old cars. I'd become involved with the local Austin 7 club and spent much of my spare time rebuilding electrical components for members, dynamos, starter motors, cutouts, voltage regulators, anything electrical really. I had a lathe and a reasonable workshop by then, and word travelled surprisingly quickly in those days. So one morning, a friend called to see me before work. Through somebody else, he'd heard about another Austin 7 sitting forgotten in a field and thought I might be interested. That sort of thing happened fairly regularly back then. Old pre-war cars were still everywhere, abandoned in gardens, behind garages, in hedgerows, or simply left where they had stopped years before. Why? Most people had no money to restore them. Many were simply broken for parts to keep others alive. Now remember the culture then. Young people were not interested in old cars. They wanted something flashy and modern. Older people were tired of repairing the old cars, so they didn't want them either. They were just laid around everywhere. You can't believe it, but that is the situation. Now you cannot find them. Anyway, after a little detective work, I eventually found the owner of the field. The Austin 7 didn't belong to him. It belonged to a mechanic friend who'd played with the little car around the field as a teenager, but long since abandoned it. He told me he had no longer had time for it, but still remembered with affection driving it around the field when he was younger. And he thought if I could save it, I could have it for a small fee. The next day we went to see it. He appeared carrying a battery in one hand and a gallon can of petrol in the other. Then he handed me a saw. At the time I had absolutely no idea why. The Austin had obviously been sitting in the field for years, but when we arrived, I soon discovered what the reason for the saw was. A small tree had grown up through the floor of the car and had pushed the old seat aside, grown up through the cabin, and finally emerged through the sliding roof. Even now, all these years later, I can still remember standing there, looking at it and thinking how absurd it seemed. Nature had slowly claimed the car as its own. But the mechanic seemed completely unconcerned. He simply cut the little tree down, cleaned a few things, connected the battery, poured some petrol directly into the carburetor and into the tank. He explained that although the Austin was originally 6 volts, the extra power from the 12-volt battery would spin the engine over much faster and probably help to start it. Then he pressed the starter. To my amazement, the little engine burst into life almost immediately. A few moments later, he was driving around the field with a grin from ear to ear. He stopped somewhere beside me. I say stopped because he didn't brake. The car had no brakes. And with a smile he said, "I've decided not to sell it." Then he laughed. Thankfully, the Austin was only about 20 minutes from my home. So despite the complete lack of brakes, we decided the sensible thing to do was to tow it home. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder how we survived some of the things we casually did in those days. I climbed into the Austin. He tied on a rope and gave me only one instruction. If you have to stop, try not to run into the back of me too hard. I remember one junction particularly well. As he slowed, I gently collided with the back of his car. Unfortunately, at that exact moment, I managed to run over the tow rope. He drove off again, without realizing the rope had wrapped itself tightly around one of my front wheels. The Austin tyres simply skidded along the road while I waved frantically and shouted like a madman. Eventually we stopped, untangled everything, and somehow continued home. And that was how many old cars survived back then. Not through careful planning, or money, or professional restoration, but through enthusiasm, optimism, improvisation, and occasionally a complete absence of common sense. I honestly can't remember anything particularly remarkable about the restoration afterwards. The strange part was never the repair. The strange part was always finding an Austin 7 in a field with a tree growing through the roof and discovering that beautiful little car still wanted to start. I've owned many old cars over the years, but somehow I've never forgotten that little Austin 7 in the field. If cars have a soul, I think it simply wanted to live.